My name is Clara. I'm 29 years old, and for 3 years I lived with a narcissist who erased me piece by piece until I felt invisible. This is my narcissist true story. I used to think that silence was peaceful, that it meant safety, but with him silence was a weapon. His silence was heavy, cold, and punishing. Living with a narcissist meant waking up every morning not knowing if I would be spoken to or treated like I didn't exist. And the most painful part was that I started believing I didn't deserve to exist at all. At first, it wasn't screaming or insults. It was the absence of words, the way he could sit across from me at dinner and not look up once, not acknowledge me, as if I was air. That was his favorite form of narcissist control. Silence. If I asked a question, he wouldn't answer. If I tried to share something from my day, he would look at his phone. If I laughed, he stayed expressionless. The message was always the same. You don't matter. This was the beginning of the emotional abuse story that consumed 3 years of my life. He had little ways of twisting even the smallest things. If I spoke about work, he'd sigh loudly and say, "Why do you always talk so much? Nobody cares about that." If I tried to express how I felt, he'd accuse me of being dramatic. "You're too sensitive. You always make everything about you." The irony was that he had already made everything about him. Slowly, his criticisms became my reality. I stopped sharing. I stopped laughing. I stopped existing. This is what it feels like to be trapped by a narcissist. He doesn't always scream. Sometimes he just deletes you. What made it worse was how subtle it all was. I didn't have bruises to point to, nothing that the outside world could see. It was psychological abuse disguised as quiet indifference. It was toxic love in its most suffocating form, being ignored until I doubted if I was worth noticing at all. He convinced me that my words had no value, that my presence was irrelevant. This narcissist relationship wasn't full of storms. It was an endless gray fog where I couldn't even find myself. There were nights when I lay next to him in bed, my back turned, my body trembling because I wanted him to touch me, to say something, to show me I was there. Instead, he would roll away, pick up his phone, or fall asleep without a word. That neglect was louder than any insult. It told me that I was invisible, unwanted, erased. The silence screamed inside me, and the more I tried to break it, the more he punished me by withdrawing even further. That was his narcissist manipulation. He taught me that if I wanted peace, I had to stay small, quiet, and invisible. Sometimes, I would cry silently, hoping my tears would soften him. But he would wake up, glance at me and say, "What now? You're crying again? You're pathetic." And then he would turn away. That phrase burned into me. "You're pathetic." I carried it like a secret tattoo under my skin. That's how living with a narcissist changes you. You start hearing his voice in your head even when he isn't speaking. I remember one Sunday morning so vividly. I made coffee, set the table, even bought his favorite bread. I wanted, desperately, just one morning where we felt like a couple. He walked into the kitchen, looked at the table, and said nothing. He sat, ate quickly, left the cup half full, and went back to his office without a word. I stood there, staring at 2 empty chairs and untouched plates, feeling like I had set breakfast for a ghost. That was the kind of humiliation he inflicted. It wasn't in front of people. It was in the quietest moments of intimacy, where I longed to feel seen, and instead felt erased. I didn't realize it at the time, but those little daily neglects were as violent as a slap. They destroyed me slowly. This was narcissist abuse in its quietest, deadliest form. A gaslighting story without obvious lies. Just silence so heavy that I started to believe my existence didn't matter. I thought maybe I was too much. Maybe I was boring. Maybe no one would ever want to hear me. That's the invisible prison he built around me. Not bars of iron, but the belief that my voice was worthless. And the saddest part? I stayed. I stayed because I thought love meant enduring. Because I believed if I was patient enough, quiet enough, good enough, he would finally see me. But in a toxic relationship with a narcissist, invisibility is never broken. They don't love you when you're whole. They only keep you when you're silent, erased, controlled. This is only the beginning of my narcissist confession. The first layer of pain. The neglect, the silence, the cold indifference. Those were the opening wounds. Soon they would turn into deeper scars. Lies, manipulation, betrayal, and a level of humiliation I never thought I could survive. He didn't just ignore me. That would have been cruel enough. But the real torture was when he decided to speak, when he decided to twist reality until I couldn't trust my own thoughts anymore. This is where the narcissist manipulation became unbearable. It was no longer just silence. It was words used like knives, carefully planted doubts that left me questioning everything. My memory, my perception, even my sanity. I remember one night, I finally gathered the courage to tell him how much his neglect was hurting me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking, and I whispered, "I feel invisible to you." He didn't even pause before replying, "You're imagining things. I talk to you every day. You're just too needy, too dramatic." His voice was calm, almost soothing, but the message destroyed me. What you feel isn't real. That was the beginning of his gaslighting story. He would deny things that I had seen with my own eyes. If I told him, "You didn't answer me last night when I asked you about dinner," he would smirk and say, "Yes, I did. You just don't listen." If I said, "You didn't look at me once during our entire meal," he'd laugh and reply, "You're obsessed. Stop exaggerating." Each denial chipped away at me, left me spiraling in self-doubt. Was I truly exaggerating? Was I inventing pain just to get his attention? Living with a narcissist means losing the ability to trust your own reality. Sometimes the lies were obvious. One evening, I found text messages on his phone from another woman. They weren't graphic, but they were intimate enough to make my chest tighten. When I confronted him, shaking, he didn't even flinch. He just laughed. "That's a coworker. You always twist everything. God, you're paranoid." My voice trembled as I tried to insist. "But you called her baby." He smirked again and said, "You're imagining things. It doesn't say that." I looked at the screen again, and somehow, in that moment, I doubted my own eyes. That's the power of narcissist control. He made me feel like I couldn't trust even the words written in front of me. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the way he made me feel insane for noticing. That's how psychological abuse works. It's not just the lies and betrayal. It's the humiliation of being told you're crazy for reacting like a human being. He wanted me to believe that my instincts, my feelings, my thoughts were all broken. And eventually, I did. I started apologizing for things I hadn't done. I started saying sorry for asking questions, for needing answers, for wanting love. That's how narcissist abuse strips you of dignity. You end up begging for the scraps of truth. Another memory still haunts me. I had spent the whole day preparing dinner, hoping maybe this time he would look at me, say something kind. But as we sat down, he barely touched the food. He just scrolled through his phone, smiling at the screen. I asked timidly, "Who are you talking to?" He looked up at me, annoyed, and said, "No one. Stop being jealous." I knew I saw her name flash across his screen, but he said it with such certainty that I started to question if my eyes had betrayed me. This is how being trapped by a narcissist feels. Reality bends until you can't tell if you're living in truth or in his story. And he loved that power. I could see it in his face when I doubted myself. He would lean back, calm, almost smug, and say things like, "You really need help, Clara. You're losing it." The humiliation of those words was worse than any insult. Because once you're convinced you're broken, you stop fighting. You stop questioning. You surrender. And that's what he wanted. Total control. I started writing things down in secret, like a diary of his words and actions, just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But when he found the notebook one night, he exploded with laughter. "You're pathetic," he said, tossing it on the floor. "You really sit here making up abuse stories? Do you want to be a victim that badly?" My face burned with shame. I remember standing there paralyzed, while he walked away smirking. That was his favorite trick. Turn my pain into a joke, make me feel ridiculous for even noticing his cruelty. And yet, after every denial, every manipulation, he had a way of reeling me back in. Sometimes he would break the silence just long enough to say, "You know I love you, right? I just don't show it the way you want." Or he'd touch my arm lightly and whisper, "You're the only one who really gets me." Those crumbs of affection were poison. They kept me hooked in this toxic love, made me believe maybe I was the problem. Maybe if I just adjusted myself more, he would finally see me. That's how I became trapped in the invisible prison he built. The cycle was always the same. Silence, neglect, lies, denial, then a tiny drop of affection to confuse me again. It was like drowning, but every so often he'd lift me above the water just long enough to breathe before shoving me under again. And I hated myself for thanking him for those brief moments of air. Looking back, I see now that this wasn't love. It was narcissist manipulation in its purest form. Control disguised as affection, lies disguised as reality, neglect disguised as normal. He made me believe that my loneliness was my fault, that my invisibility was proof of my unworthiness. This is why narcissist abuse is so dangerous. It convinces you to erase yourself long before he finishes erasing you. There were times I wanted to scream, to fight back, to prove that I wasn't crazy. But the truth is, I was already broken down, worn out by the constant gaslighting, drained by the endless cycle of silence and denial. Living with a narcissist doesn't just take your happiness, it steals your truth, your voice, your ability to stand firmly in reality. And once that's gone, you're nothing but a shadow of who you used to be. That's where I was after 2 years. A shadow. Still breathing, still existing, but invisible even to myself. The silence and gaslighting were already unbearable, but the real breaking point came when his cruelty stopped being private and started spilling into the open. That's when the narcissist abuse escalated into humiliation and betrayal that left scars I still carry. It began subtly, as it always did. One evening, we were invited to a small dinner with his friends. I was nervous, hoping to finally feel like a part of his world. I dressed carefully, chose a simple dress, and even practiced a few stories to share. But the moment I tried to speak at the table, he cut me off. I had barely started talking about my work when he looked at me and said, with that cold smile, "Clara, no one cares about that boring stuff. Let's not put everyone to sleep." The table laughed lightly, following his lead. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was public humiliation. He enjoyed watching me shrink in front of others, like I was his little joke. That dinner was the first of many. He made me the punchline whenever he had an audience. If I mispronounced a word, he'd chuckle and say, "See what I have to deal with?" If I tried to express an opinion, he'd smirk and say, "Clara thinks she's smart today." People would laugh awkwardly, not realizing that those small cuts were destroying me. But he knew. He wanted me to feel small not just in private, but everywhere. That's the cruelest form of narcissist control, turning your pain into entertainment. Then came the betrayal. I had already seen suspicious messages on his phone, but he had convinced me I was paranoid. Still, deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, he told me he was working late. My chest tightened with that familiar dread, but I stayed home, waiting. Hours passed. Finally, out of desperation, I checked his location on my phone. He wasn't at work. He was at a restaurant. I stared at the screen, frozen, before texting him. "Where are you?" His reply came quickly. "At the office. Why?" My hand shook as I typed, "I see you're at a restaurant." Minutes later, he stormed into the apartment, his face filled with rage. "You're spying on me? You're insane. Do you want to ruin us with your paranoia?" He never admitted the lie. He never explained the dinner. Instead, he flipped it, accused me of betrayal for checking. That's the cruelty of narcissist manipulation. You catch them in a lie, and somehow you end up apologizing. And I did. I begged for forgiveness that night. Forgiveness for doubting him, for checking, for not trusting. I apologized while he stayed silent, watching me crumble. That silence was his victory, but the cruelty didn't stop there. The more broken I became, the bolder he grew. One of the worst nights of my life was my birthday. I had told him weeks before that all I wanted was to have dinner together, just the two of us. I didn't need gifts. I just wanted to feel seen. That evening, I dressed up, lit candles, cooked a simple meal. I waited and waited. Hours went by. Finally, at midnight, he stumbled in, drunk, laughing at something on his phone. I stood in the kitchen, holding the untouched meal, tears burning my eyes. When he saw me, he rolled his eyes and muttered, "Don't start. You don't deserve to celebrate. You've done nothing with your life." Those words cut deeper than any slap could. You don't deserve to celebrate. That was my birthday gift from the man I loved. That night, I sat on the floor in the dark, staring at the cold plates of food. I felt like a ghost haunting my own apartment. That's how living with a narcissist feels. You become invisible even on the days that should remind you that you exist. He also began isolating me more and more. At first, It was subtle discouragement. "Your friends are fake," he'd say. "They don't really care about you." Then he'd refuse to go to gatherings, claiming he was tired. Eventually, he'd make me feel guilty for even wanting to see people. "Why would you choose them over me?" he'd demand. I started canceling plans, one by one, until I had no one left. My phone stopped buzzing, my weekends were empty, and my world became just him. That's narcissist isolation. It's not about locking you in a room, it's about convincing you there's no one else waiting outside. And when I was completely isolated, he tightened the grip. He decided when we spoke, when we didn't. He decided if I was allowed to feel happy, or if I had to sit in silence. He controlled every breath of my day without ever raising a hand. That's the invisible prison. Bars built out of humiliation, lies, and silence. There were moments I thought about leaving, but then he'd throw me just enough crumbs to keep me chained. After ignoring me for days, he'd suddenly hug me from behind and whisper, "You're everything to me." Or after humiliating me in front of his friends, he'd stroke my hair at night and murmur, "You know I don't mean it, right? You're too sensitive." And I'd cling to those lies because they were the only warmth I ever got. That's the toxic relationship cycle. Hurt, neglect, betrayal, then a tiny spark of hope that keeps you trapped. The escalation wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was slow and steady, like poison dripping into my veins. By the end of the 3rd year, I wasn't Clara anymore. I was a shell, a quiet shadow, moving through each day waiting for silence, waiting for humiliation, waiting for betrayal. That's what narcissist abuse does. It doesn't just hurt you, it erases you. People often ask, "Why didn't you just leave?" They don't understand that when you're trapped by a narcissist, the prison isn't made of locks or chains. It's made of fear, shame, and the tiny drops of false hope that keep you crawling back. My invisible prison was built slowly, piece by piece, until I no longer believed I had the strength to walk away. At first, I stayed because I thought silence was better than loneliness. I told myself, at least I have someone. Even when he ignored me, at least he was there. The idea of an empty apartment, of waking up completely alone, felt more terrifying than the neglect I lived with daily. That's how living with a narcissist poisons your mind. You start to believe that scraps of attention are better than nothing, that toxic love is still love. Then came the shame. I had told my family and friends in the beginning that I had found someone special, someone who was different. I painted him as charming, intelligent, stable. How could I admit later that behind closed doors he treated me like I didn't exist? I felt humiliated by my own choices. I imagined the judgment in their eyes if I told the truth. How could you stay with someone like that? How could you let yourself be erased? So I stayed, because leaving would mean confessing how broken I had become. He also planted fear so deep inside me that I couldn't tell where his voice ended and mine began. He'd say things like, "No one else will ever love you. Who would put up with you?" Or, "If you leave me, you'll regret it. You're nothing without me." I laughed it off at first, but over time, I absorbed it. His words became my beliefs. I started to think maybe I was too sensitive, too boring, too needy for anyone else. That's the heart of psychological abuse. It convinces you to chain yourself. Financially, he tightened the noose as well. He didn't forbid me to work, but he constantly belittled my job. "Your salary is nothing," he'd sneer. "I pay for everything that matters." He would remind me daily of how dependent I was on him, how weak I'd be without him. Even though I had my own income, he made me feel like a child, like I couldn't survive outside his control. That dependency became another bar in my invisible prison. I also stayed because I kept hoping he would change. After every episode of silence or humiliation, there would be a moment, brief, fleeting, where he softened. He'd touch my face and whisper, "You know I love you. I'm just stressed." He'd buy me flowers after ignoring me for a week, and those flowers would feel like oxygen. I clung to them, desperate for proof that he was capable of love. This is how narcissist manipulation keeps you hooked. They starve you until you're grateful for crumbs. The isolation made leaving even harder. By the time I realized how bad things were, I had no one left to turn to. My friends had stopped calling. My family lived far away, and I had distanced myself out of shame. The only person I had was him, the very person who was destroying me. I remember one night, after he had humiliated me again, I picked up my phone to call an old friend. My fingers hovered over her name, but I couldn't do it. What would I even say? "Hi, I need help because the man I love makes me feel invisible. It sounded absurd even to me, so I put the phone down. That's narcissist isolation. It leaves you with no lifeline. I told myself over and over, tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow he will notice me. Tomorrow he will love me the way I need. That hope was my cage. Every morning, I woke up thinking, maybe this would be the day he'd smile at me, ask me about my day, hold me without resentment. Every night, I went to bed with the same emptiness. But still, I clung to the fantasy. Because admitting it would never change meant admitting I had wasted years of my life. The fear of starting over also haunted me. I was 29, almost 30. He made me believe that was too old, that my chances at love had expired. No one wants a woman your age, he'd say casually, like it was a fact. And I believed him. I believed I was unlovable, used, finished. That fear chained me tighter than anything else. There were also moments when he dangled the future in front of me like a prize I could never reach. Sometimes he'd say, maybe one day we'll get married. Maybe we'll have kids. My heart would leap at those words, even though they never came true. That's how lies and betrayal work in a narcissist relationship. He gave me just enough hope to keep me waiting, always waiting, for a future that would never exist. And then there was the fear of myself. I was afraid of who I had become. I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror anymore. My eyes were dull, my voice quiet, my spirit broken. I thought, if I leave, who will I be? At least with him I knew my role, to stay small, stay silent, stay invisible. Without him, I didn't know if there was anything left of me. That's the deepest layer of the invisible prison, believing that freedom is scarier than captivity. So I stayed. For 3 years, I stayed in that toxic relationship. I stayed while he silenced me, humiliated me, betrayed me. I stayed because I was afraid of loneliness, ashamed of failure, convinced no one else would ever love me. I stayed because he taught me to believe I deserved nothing more. Looking back now, I see how complete the trap was. It wasn't just his control. It was my own fear, my own shame, my own broken hope that held me there. That's why narcissist abuse is so devastating. It doesn't just imprison you in his world. It convinces you to lock the door from the inside. I don't know exactly when I realized I was gone. Maybe it wasn't one moment, but a series of small deaths. Each silence, each lie, each humiliation. Until one day I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. My name is Clara, but inside that apartment, I had no name. I was invisible. That was my life. A narcissist relationship where my existence was denied until I forgot who I was. I remember one night more vividly than any other. He had ignored me for days. The silence was so heavy I felt like I was suffocating. I stood in the kitchen, holding a glass of water, and suddenly realized my hands were trembling so badly the glass almost slipped. My reflection in the window looked pale, hollow. For a terrifying second, I thought, maybe I really am nothing. Maybe disappearing wouldn't even matter. That's what being trapped by a narcissist does to you. You don't just feel erased by him, you start erasing yourself. He walked in that night, brushed past me without a word, and sat on the couch scrolling through his phone. I stood there, frozen, waiting for him to acknowledge me, to say anything. But there was nothing, just the sound of his fingers tapping the screen. And in that silence, I realized I could scream, and he still wouldn't look up. That was my humiliation, living with someone who made me feel like a ghost haunting my own life. I don't want to pretend I had a moment of strength, because the truth is, I didn't. I didn't slam the door. I didn't fight back. I didn't walk away with pride. I stayed longer than I should have. I stayed until my body ached from holding back tears, until my mind felt twisted with gaslighting, until my soul was thin and empty. That's the reality of an emotional abuse story. It doesn't end with a clean escape. It ends with pieces of you scattered on the floor. Even now, I hear his voice in my head. You're too sensitive. You're pathetic. No one else will ever love you. Those words are scars that don't fade. They creep into my thoughts when I try to smile, when I try to dream about a future. That's the lingering trauma. His silence still echoes in my chest, even when he's not there. Sometimes, I still wonder if I made it all up. That's the poison of a gaslighting story. You doubt your own suffering. But then I remember the birthdays forgotten, the dinners ruined, the friends lost, the nights spent crying beside someone who didn't care. That wasn't imagination. That was psychological abuse. That was my reality. I stayed because I thought he was all I deserved. I stayed because I believed his lies. I stayed because the invisible prison felt safer than the unknown outside. And in some ways, I still feel like I'm inside that prison. The walls are thinner now, but they're still there. Fear and shame don't vanish overnight. But here's the truth I'm slowly learning to hold on to. I was never invisible. He just refused to see me. He wanted me small, silent, erased, but that doesn't mean I was worthless. It means he was too broken, too cruel, to recognize my value. He only loved me when I was broken, and I don't want to be broken anymore. I don't have a perfect ending for you. I don't have freedom yet. Some days I still feel his shadow on my skin, his silence in my ears, but I also have a whisper inside me now, a voice that says, "You are here. You exist. You matter." Maybe that's enough to start. Maybe that's the first crack in the prison walls. This is my narcissist confession, my toxic love story, my truth. I lived 3 years with a narcissist who made me feel invisible. I don't know if I'll ever fully heal, but I know one thing. I don't want to disappear anymore.